The door had not been opened in 11 years. Not by choice, not by accident, not by anything. The lock faced inward. That was the part nobody ever thought about. The part that, if you walked past it quickly, you'd miss entirely. Most locks face out. Most locks are there to keep people from getting in. This one was built to keep someone from getting out. Her name was Ilara. Nobody in the kingdom knew that. She was 4 years old when her father decided she was too dangerous to exist in the world and too valuable to destroy. 4 years old, which means she doesn't actually remember the decision being made. She doesn't remember being carried up the stairs. She doesn't remember the door closing. What she remembers is the window. It was small, about the width of 2 hands placed side by side, and it faced the interior courtyard of the Voss estate. Not the gardens, not the sky, the courtyard. She could see the stone below, and the roof of the western kitchen, and sometimes a bird if it landed on the wrong ledge. That was the view. That was everything outside that she was allowed to have. She named the birds. She had to stop naming them eventually, because birds don't stay. She named them anyway. By the time she was 10, she had read every book on the shelf. By 12, she had read them again and started making notes in the margins. By 15, the notes in the margins were longer than the books themselves. By 18, she was working on what she privately called her third reading, which was less like reading and more like arguing, pencil in hand, disagreeing with authors who had been dead for 200 years, winning every argument because they couldn't write back. She was 22 when the door opened. She was sitting in the chair beside the window, book open in her lap, when she heard footsteps on the stairs that were not the footsteps she knew. Bernard walked with a limp. His left knee, she had decided, though she'd never asked. Margaret's footsteps were quick and light and slightly impatient. The young one she called Finn moved like someone who was always almost late for something. These footsteps were different, heavy, even. Not in a hurry, but not slow either. The kind of footsteps that didn't think about themselves at all, which meant whoever was making them had never needed to be quiet a day in their life. More than one person, maybe 4, maybe 5. She closed the book, marked the page. She looked at the door. The lock clicked from the outside. In 11 years, she had never heard that sound from the outside. The mechanism was always worked from within. Bernard, then Margaret, then Bernard again on the days Margaret was occupied. Always from within, always with a specific rhythm. 3 turns, a pause, 1 more. This was 1 turn, 2, stop. The door opened. She did not stand up. She did not move to the back of the room. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the men who came through the door, and the first thing she noticed, before she noticed anything about them at all, was how large the room suddenly seemed to shrink. There were 3 of them. The one in front was taller than the door frame wanted him to be. He had to tilt his head, slightly, just a fraction, the practiced reflex of someone who has always been this height and has stopped being annoyed by ceilings that weren't built for him. He was not dressed for show. No ceremony in the coat. No jewelry. The kind of plain that costs more than decoration because it doesn't need to try. She looked at his face. She looked at the way he was looking at the room. He was not looking at her yet. He was looking at everything that wasn't her. The single bed, the single chair, the single shelf of books, the window that was the width of 2 hands. And his expression was not doing anything visible, but something in his jaw had gone very tight. She said, "You're earlier than I calculated. I thought he'd stall longer on the stairs." That was when he looked at her. His eyes were a dark kind of gray, the color of sky right before rain decides to commit. They didn't move once they found her, didn't scan the room, didn't drop, didn't do the thing people's eyes do when they're embarrassed by what they're seeing and want to look away. He just looked at her, straight and flat and still. "How long?" he said. Not a question. She understood that. A question has a rise at the end, a breath of uncertainty. This had neither. 18 years, she said, since I was 4. Formally since I was 3 and 11 months, which is when my father filed the death record with the parish, though he waited to put me up here until I was old enough to manage without a nurse. The nurse was a complication he didn't want. Nobody spoke. One of the men behind him, shorter, younger, with the look of someone who had heard a lot of difficult things in his line of work and thought he had developed immunity, had gone very still. The tall man did not react. He just became more still than he already was. She had read enough history to know who he was. She had been reading his name in political texts for 4 years. She knew his lineage, his legislation, his military record, the names of the 3 noble houses he had officially sanctioned, and the 2 he had quietly bankrupted for violations that never made it to the formal record. She knew what his stillness meant. She had read about it. Men who had fought beside him had described it in memoirs, that specific quality of not moving, not calm, not cold, but the held breath before something very final happens. She said, because she had calculated this moment in 11 different ways, and this was the version most likely to produce a useful outcome. My father is on the 2nd floor. The east sitting room. If I know his habits, he'll be expecting you to come back down. The man who was not a wall looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned around and walked out. The shorter man, Ren, she would learn his name later, though she'd been calling him the careful one in her head since he walked in, hesitated at the door. He looked at her the way people look at a math problem they haven't finished solving. She said, "I'll wait." He left. She touched the window latch. Old habit. The metal was cool and familiar under her fingers, the ridged surface of it worn smooth in the places her thumb always went. She had touched this latch probably 12,000 times in 11 years. More. She had never opened the window. The latch was there, but the mechanism that would push the glass out had been removed before she arrived, so touching it accomplished nothing practical. She touched it anyway. It was the thing her hands went to when she didn't know what else to do with them. She sat with her hand on the latch and waited and listened to the sounds of her father's estate going very wrong somewhere below. She left the tower 53 minutes later. She counted. She took 2 things, the book she'd been reading and the pencil she'd been using for the margins. Everything else in the room was either furniture she didn't own or books she'd already finished arguing with. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just a moment, 3 seconds at most, and looked at the room one last time. 412 stones in the ceiling. She'd counted wrong the first time, got it right by the 3rd attempt. She walked through the door. The stairs were stone, worn smooth in the middle from centuries of feet that were not hers. She counted them, 14, then a landing, then 9 more down to the main corridor. The corridor smelled like wood polish and old stone, and something that might have been her father's particular brand of fear, though she acknowledged that last one was probably her projecting. She held the book against her chest and walked. The estate was not quiet. There were voices somewhere, formal ones, tightly controlled, the specific register of men who are very angry and are doing everything possible to perform the opposite. She recognized one of the voices as her father's. She walked toward the front of the house without looking into rooms. The tall man was at the bottom of the main staircase. He was not alone. He had 4 more people with him now, all of them with that same quality of being armed without showing it, comfortable with occupying space, not particularly concerned about anything in the immediate vicinity. He looked at her when she came down the stairs. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing that morning, which were clean because she was meticulous about cleaning, in the absence of almost everything else to do, but were also the only clothes she owned, which meant they were worn thin at the elbows, and the hem was beginning to fray at the hem, and they were 3 years old and had been let out at the waist twice. He didn't look at the clothes the way people look at something pitiable. He just looked at her, and then looked at the door and said, "Come." She came, outside was. She stopped 3 steps past the door, not because anything happened. Nothing happened. The sky didn't crack open, no one said anything, no dramatic signal occurred. She just stopped because outside was very large, and she had not been outside in 11 years, and the sky above the estate was a pale winter white, and it was just very large, larger than the courtyard, larger than she had been calculating for. She had known, intellectually, that outside was large. She had read about it extensively. Knowing a thing and standing inside it are different categories of experience. She breathed once, twice, looked at the sky until she had made a memory of it that she was reasonably confident she wouldn't lose. Then she walked to the convoy. Nobody said anything about the stopping. Nobody looked at her with the particular flavor of pity she had been bracing for. The careful one, Wren, held the carriage door, and that was all. She got in. The carriage started moving. She counted bridges. 7, between the Voss estate and the capital. Each one a slightly different height, over a slightly different stretch of water. She watched them through the carriage window, the first view she'd had that wasn't the interior courtyard of the Voss estate in 11 years, and filed each one away like a fact she might need later. She didn't know what she was preparing for, exactly. She was just preparing. It was the only mode she had. The palace was large in the way that things built to communicate power are always large. Not because they need to be, but because they are making an argument to everyone who looks at them. She could see the argument from the road. She understood it. She had read the historical texts about its construction, the deliberate mathematics of the proportions, the way the towers were positioned relative to the main gate to produce a specific psychological effect on the person approaching. She counted the towers anyway. 11. One more than the record said. There had been an addition in the East Wing 12 years ago, which she had read about in a political dispatch that had somehow found its way into one of the books Bernard brought. Wren showed her to a room in the East Wing. It had 3 windows. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the 3 windows for probably longer than was socially appropriate, but Wren didn't say anything about it. He had the quality of someone who was very good at not saying things. The window on the left looks south, she said. The one in the middle looks east. What does the one on the right look at? The gardens, he said. She looked at the window on the right. Thank you, she said. He left. She went to each window in turn, stood at each one, looked at what was there. The south view was the outer wall, and beyond it the city. Buildings she could name from maps she'd studied, arranged in an order she'd memorized 3 years ago, now actual and solid and real before her eyes. The east view was sky, open, flat, gray-white, enormous. The garden view was gardens, brown and bare at this time of year. The formal beds laid out in geometric patterns, a fountain at the center switched off for winter, 3 paths crossing at the center, benches at intervals. She put her hand on the latch of the garden window. This one opened. She stood there with her hand on the latch that actually opened for a while. She didn't open it yet. She mapped the room instead, then the corridor outside, then over the next 3 days the whole of the East Wing, then the main wing, then the sections she was permitted to walk, then the sections she was not technically prohibited from walking, then the full palace. 7 exits from the East Wing alone, 12 from the main building if you counted the servants' doors, 19 if you counted the cellar access. She was not planning to leave. She needed the exits anyway. On the 5th day she asked the head housekeeper if there was work she could do. The woman, broad and brisk and not unkind, just organized, offered her embroidery. Elara looked at the embroidery hoop. She said, "Is there something with words?" They tried her in the correspondence office first, where the palace's administrative letters were drafted. She lasted 2 hours before she had restructured the filing system, rewritten 3 letters that had been composed with what she could only describe as a cheerful disregard for precision, and politely suggested to the head clerk that his indexing method was 12 years out of date. The head clerk was not pleased. She was redirected to the archive. The archive was 3 rooms full of floor-to-ceiling shelves, most of the material on the shelves uncatalogued because the previous archivist had died mid-project 8 years ago and nobody had properly taken it up since. There was a desk in the second room with a lamp and a chair that wobbled slightly on its left front leg. She sat down at the desk. She looked at the shelves. She was, for the first time in her memory, somewhere that had more things for her to read than she had already read. She put both hands flat on the desk and breathed. Then she started working. The king found her there on the 9th day. She didn't hear him come in because she was deep in a volume of land records from 40 years ago, cross-referencing it against a legal text from 60 years ago and a census document from 30 years ago, 3 books open in a configuration she'd developed for this exact type of cross-referencing work. She had a pencil behind her ear and 2 more on the desk, and her notes had taken over most of the available surface. He said her name. She closed the land records, put the pencil from behind her ear back on the desk, and looked up. He was in the doorway with a document folder under his arm. Not there for her, then. There on some other business that happened to intersect with her location. She processed this. "You need the land records for the Marin Valley parcels," she said. "Third shelf from the left, second room. They're indexed by year now. I did the cataloging last week. 1680 through 1710 are separated because those years had a different administrative region designation. I've noted that on the index card." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "What are you reading?" She told him all of it. The cross-reference she was building, the legal question she was trying to answer, the gap she'd found in the census records that suggested a systematic underreporting pattern in the northern districts going back 40 years. She told him because she was not good at telling the abbreviated version. When she was in the tower, she had nobody to tell anything to, which meant that now, given an audience, she occasionally produced the complete version when the summary would have served. She expected him to stop her halfway through. He didn't. He pulled the wobble-legged chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from her and put his folder on the desk and listened to all of it. When she finished, he asked a question, a specific one, about the census methodology, that told her he had been actually following what she'd said and had found a thread to pull. She answered it. He asked another. She answered that too. They sat in the archive for 2 hours. He had come in for the land records and he left 2 hours later without them. She wasn't sure he even remembered them. She wasn't sure she had registered the time passing. After he left, she sat at the desk and looked at the space where he had been sitting and tried to catalog what had just happened the way she cataloged everything, and found, slightly to her alarm, that she could not organize it neatly. She opened the land records. She could not concentrate on the land records. She opened her notes instead and found that she'd been writing a new line in the margin of the top page without meaning to. Not words, just the same angle she always drew when she was thinking. She looked at it for a while. She closed the notes. She went to the window in the archive's third room, the one that faced the garden, and stood there until she could concentrate again. The garden was still bare, brown and formal and empty. She found it easier to think, looking at something that didn't have very many parts. She started going to the courtyard before dawn. This happened accidentally. She had mapped the palace well enough to know her exits, but she had not yet found the outdoor spaces at a time when they were empty, and empty was what she needed. Not because she didn't like the palace. She had come to something close to comfortable in her rooms, close to something else in the archive, but because outside was still something she was learning, and she learned better without audience. The courtyard at that hour was nobody's. The guards had a rotation that left it unobserved between the fourth and fifth bell. She knew this from 3 days of listening to the pattern of footsteps from her room. She went out the garden door, crossed the east path, and stood in the open air. The sky in the time before dawn was colors she didn't have complete vocabularies for. She had a working list. Amber, she had recently acquired. Brass, pewter, a kind of deep blue that wasn't quite navy, that she'd been calling council blue in her head because it reminded her of the tone of the formal ceiling in the main hall. She was building the vocabulary from scratch, cross-referencing what she saw against color terms in the books she'd read, and she was aware this was a slightly unusual project, but she had always had slightly unusual projects. It was 11 days after she'd arrived at the palace that the king came out of the south garden door while she was standing in the courtyard. He stopped. She hadn't heard him. The wind had been moving the bare branches of the garden trees, and she'd been listening to that and watching the sky go amber. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She said without turning, "The color this morning is a kind of bronze. I don't think bronze is exactly right, but I haven't found a better word yet." A pause. He said, "Amber." She tried it. "Amber." "Yes," she said. "That's better. I had amber for a different shade, slightly warmer, more orange. But maybe amber is a range. I'll adjust the list." "You have a list." "Of sky colors. I've been outside for 11 days. I'm still learning the vocabulary." She heard him walk across the courtyard and stop somewhere to her left. Not beside her, a few feet away, enough space to not be something. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not looking at it, but knowing precisely where it is. He said nothing. She said nothing. They stood there while the sky finished going amber and then shifted into the gray-white of full winter morning. It took about 20 minutes. She had timed it on previous mornings. When the color was gone, she said, "I'll let you know when I have a word for bronze." Then she walked back inside. She touched the garden window latch when she got back to her room. She hadn't touched it in 4 days, which was the longest interval since she'd arrived. She stood there with her hand on the latch and looked at where she'd been standing in the courtyard. She could see the spot from this window, just barely, and thought, "I have made a mistake." She was not alarmed by the thought. She had made mistakes before. She was good at managing them. She was slightly alarmed by not being alarmed. She went to the archive. She could not concentrate on the archive. She wrote amber, broader range than previously noted, in her color vocabulary list, and stared at it for a while. 31 days after leaving the tower, she learned about the gift. She had known about it her whole life, of course. You can't be told you're too dangerous to exist in the world without developing a fairly specific understanding of what the danger is. Her father had explained it when she was 7, a calm, clinical explanation that she had recognized even then as a man talking about a weapon and pretending he was talking about a liability. Touch. That was the whole of it. Skin contact. A hand, a shoulder, any surface where another person's warmth reached hers, and she felt what they were carrying. Not the surface of it, the real thing, the part they'd built 12 other things on top of to hide. She had not touched another person in 11 years. The thing about not touching people, and she had thought about this extensively, in the way you think about everything extensively when you have nothing but time, is that it becomes a whole architecture. The way you hold yourself, the way you move through doorways, the way you stand at a specific angle in rooms, so that people passing do not brush your arm. She had built this architecture so completely in the tower, in response to nothing more than a theoretical risk, that she had carried it out into the world without thinking, the way you carry a habit you don't remember forming. She was in the archive's main room when she found the gap in the catalog, a section of records that had been misfiled under a wrong date, meaning they'd been essentially invisible for 8 years. She had been looking for them for 2 days. She made a sound when she found them. Not a word, just a sound, the involuntary small noise of relief, finding a gap you've been staring at. She pulled the box from the shelf. It was heavier than expected, and she had slightly miscalculated her grip on the shelf edge, and her foot slipped on the step stool, and she went sideways, and the box went with her and his hand. On her arm. She didn't know he was in the archive. He came in like he always came in. No announcement, moving quietly for someone his size, and she hadn't heard him, and he was close enough that when she went sideways, his reflex was faster than her fall. 1 second, maybe less. His hand on her arm above the elbow, steadying, and the contact was, she was thrown back 11 years. 22. All of it at once. The shape of what he carried arrived not like information but like weather. Total, atmospheric, filling all the available space. She felt the grief first, because it was the loudest thing, the oldest thing, wound so tightly around his sense of duty that they had fused years ago, and he probably could not have told you any more, where one ended and the other began. She felt the exhaustion of a man who had decided, at some point early enough to be foundational, that rest was something other people did. She felt the loneliness, and this was the part that caught her, because she had been preparing for the grief and the exhaustion, and had not prepared for the loneliness, which was not the quiet loneliness of someone who wished for company, but the specific loneliness of someone who did not believe they were allowed to want it, who had put the wanting in a room a long time ago and locked the door from the outside. She recognized the architecture. She stepped back. She was upright. She had caught herself on the shelf. The box of records was on the floor, its contents mostly intact. He had stepped back too. His hand was no longer on her arm. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify, somewhere between careful and questioning. He had noticed something change in her face. She knew this. She was not good at keeping things off her face in unexpected moments. She said, "Thank you. I have it." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I have calculated this." He looked at her for a moment. He did not ask what she'd calculated. He picked up the box from the floor and put it on the desk, and then went to the shelves to find the land records she had told him were there before. She watched him find them and take them and leave. She sat down at the desk. She put both hands flat on the surface. She looked at the window that faced the garden. The garden was brown and still. She breathed. She did not write anything in her notes for a long time. Then she wrote, in the margin of her catalog page, in letters smaller than her usual handwriting, "Same architecture, different door." She closed the notebook. She went back to cataloging. She told him a week later, not everything, one thing, the specific thing. She told him because she had spent 7 days calculating the cost of not telling him and concluded that the cost was higher. He had been in the archive 4 times since the incident. Each time she had managed a normal conversation while simultaneously carrying the full weight of what she'd felt in that 1 second of contact, and the management was expensive. The calculations were getting complicated. She needed to simplify. She found him in the late afternoon in the corridor outside the archive. He was heading somewhere. He stopped when she appeared. She said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "All right." She said, "When you caught me, last week, when you grabbed my arm." He waited. "I felt what you're carrying," she said. "Not, I don't mean I observed your face or your posture. I mean I felt it. That's the gift my father decided made me too dangerous to be in the world. Touch. Skin contact. I feel the real thing, underneath whatever people put on top." He was very still. Not the pre-consequence stillness. Something different. Slower. She said, "I'm not going to use it against you. I'm not going to tell anyone what I felt. I'm telling you because you should know that I know, and you should know that knowing it doesn't change anything, and you should know that I—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You should know that I understand it." He said, "What did you feel?" She looked at him. "I was not expecting that question," she said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. She was not touching the wall. There was no wall in reach that was hers. She said, "A tower, but with a view." He did not react with his face. Something happened in the gray of his eyes. A shift, the way water shifts when something moves beneath the surface. He said, "All right." She said, "All right?" He said, "You told me. I needed to know you told me. Now I know." She looked at him for a long time. "You're not going to ask more," she said. "Are you going to offer more?" "No." "Then no." She nodded once. She went back into the archive. She sat at her desk and did not open anything for 11 minutes. She counted. Then she opened the catalog and she wrote Amber, range confirmed, and looked at the words for a while. The delegation from House Marin arrived on a gray afternoon, 44 days after she'd left the tower. She was in the archive when she felt the shift in the palace. Not anything she could see, but a change in how the footsteps sounded in the corridor, a tightening in the quality of the air, the way the guards at the end of the East Wing changed positions twice in the space of 1 hour. She stayed in the archive. She heard about it from Wren. He came in the early evening and sat in the wobble-legged chair, carefully because of the wobble, and told her with the specific gentleness of someone delivering information they would have preferred not to deliver. Lord Marin, he said, had raised the question of her status in the formal audience. He said the phrase, "the Voss inconvenience." He had, in fact, said several phrases, all arriving at the same destination. She was a complication, an anomaly, a thing that didn't fit the existing categories. He had suggested, with the particular confidence of a man who had never had to justify his suggestions, that she be placed somewhere more suitable, out of sight, dissolved back into invisibility by different means. Wren said, "The king handled it." She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." She went back to the archive after he left. She sat at the desk. She opened a book and looked at the words on the page and did not read them. She put her hand on the window latch. This one, the garden-facing one, the one that opened. She put her hand on it and held it, and felt the cool metal of the mechanism, the specific texture of the lever she had learned so well that she could reconstruct it from memory. She thought, I calculated 11 different versions of how this would go. Version 3 involved a delegation. In version 3, I started mapping exits. Her eyes went to the window. The garden was dark at this hour. She couldn't see the paths. She thought, I had already started identifying the bridges. 7, between the palace and the road north. She knew them all. She sat with her hand on the latch, and the book open, and the garden invisible in the dark, and she thought about the version where she left, and the version where she didn't, and the specific difference between an open door and the willingness to walk through it, and whether those were the same thing, and whether she had ever, in 22 years, been offered the actual choice. She was still sitting there when the door of the archive opened. She didn't move her hand from the latch. He came in. He put nothing on the desk, no folder, no documents. He pulled the wobble-legged chair to the other side of the desk and sat down. She said, not turning from the window. He called me the Voss inconvenience. He said, yes, you handled it. Yes. What does that mean, handled it? He said, it means he left the hall smaller than he arrived. She breathed. She said, there will always be another Lord Marin. He said, then I will always handle it. She looked at him then, full weight of it. She said, I was mapping exits. I'd already counted the bridges. He said, stop. She said, I can't. I don't know how to stop. It's not a decision. It's just what happens. I map exits the way I breathe. It's the only vocabulary I have for being somewhere and trying to stay there. He was quiet. Then he moved. He didn't reach across and take her hand. He put his hand on the table beside hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it without contact, and left it there. He said, then map this. Put it in the catalog. You are not going anywhere. She looked at his hand beside hers. The distance between them was maybe an inch. She was aware, precisely, of what would happen if she crossed it. She was aware of what she would feel. She left the distance there. She said, very quietly, I calculated a version where that was true. I hadn't put much weight on it. He said, update the calculation. Spring came. The garden, which had been brown and bare the entire time she'd been at the palace, started doing things. She watched it from the window first, small things, the brown going slightly green at the edges, then greener. Then one morning she went to the courtyard, and there was actual color in the formal beds, small and low to the ground, but there, unambiguous, real. She was learning that the world had seasons. She had read about seasons. She had watched the light change in the interior courtyard of the Voss estate, year after year, and understood them in a theoretical way, but standing in the actual middle of one, watching it move, was different. The world was larger than she'd known, not just in space, in time. The king came to the archive less frequently now, not because of anything between them, but because of the assembly. Something was building in the political landscape. She knew the shape of it from the documents she handled, petitions, census challenges, the formal machinery of a kingdom where 3 noble houses were actively testing the limits of what they could get away with, and 2 more were watching to see what happened. She knew the shape of her own situation in the political landscape too, dead on paper, officially non-existent, removed from the tower by the Alpha King but given no formal status in the kingdom's records. She existed in a gap, real in the palace, invisible in the law, and gaps, she had learned from 40 years of land records, were how people fell through things. She had started studying Alpha law specifically for this purpose. She had found the relevant precedents. She had built the argument from them. She had not shown it to anyone. She was not sure what she was waiting for. She told herself she was refining it. She was refining it. She was also waiting for something else, something she couldn't catalog neatly, which was unusual for her and which she was choosing not to examine directly. The formal assembly was called on a morning that had managed to be both spring and cold at the same time, the light clear and bright, the air still sharp enough to remind you that winter hadn't entirely agreed to leave. She asked to attend. She asked the king directly, in the corridor outside the archive, the way she said most things to him now, direct and precise, without ornamentation. He said yes, before she'd finished the sentence. She put on the best clothes she had, which were not significantly better than the worn ones from the Voss estate, but were newer and had all their hems and no fraying elbows. She had asked Wren about palace protocol for formal assemblies, and he had explained it in enough detail that she knew what she was walking into and how to conduct herself in the space. She stood in the back of the great hall. She counted exits. 7, before the doors closed. Old habit. Unstoppable. She filed them and stopped thinking about them. The hall was full. Noble houses, representatives, officials, people who had opinions about the question of her status, and people who had only come because something was going to happen and they wanted to be present when it did. The king stood at the front. She watched him. She had spent 44 days watching him in the small increments available to her, in the archive, in the early morning courtyard, in corridors, in the very few formal occasions where they had occupied the same space. She had been building a picture from pieces. The way he was in this space, at the front of a full hall, with all of it pointed at him, was a piece she hadn't had yet. He was entirely comfortable, not performatively, not in the way of someone who had prepared to appear comfortable. He simply existed in that space like it was a room he knew well, because it was. He addressed the assembly. He laid out the facts, her father's violations, the false death record, the 18 years. He was precise. He was complete. He did not editorialize or ornament. He said the facts as facts and let them be what they were. She watched the faces of the people listening, the ones who had opinions about her inconvenience, the ones who had been waiting for an opening. The king closed the facts. Then he went further than the facts. He declared her a ward of the crown, full legal personhood, full rights under Alpha law. He named her in the record. He put his name in the record as guarantee. He said her status was not inconvenient. He said her status was settled. He said this would not be raised again. The hall was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something final has happened and everyone is still absorbing it. She was standing in the back of the room. She was not touching the wall. Her hands were at her sides. She was not counting the bridges. She found him in the courtyard that evening, late, later than her dawn hours. This was the other end of the day, the sky doing its closing colors, a different vocabulary, one she had been developing separately from the morning list. She had not planned to go to the courtyard. She had been in the archive not reading until she had registered that she was not reading and decided that there was something else she needed to do and that the archive was not where she needed to do it. She walked through the garden door. The garden was real now, green and formal and alive, the fountain running, the paths clear. She crossed to the courtyard. He was already there. He had his back partly to her, looking at the western wall, where the light was doing something with the old stone. She understood the impulse. The old stone did things with light. She stood beside him. Not too close. The same distance they had developed in all the small practices of being in spaces together. Enough room to think, close enough to talk without performing closeness. She said, "I've been updating the calculation." He said, "What did you find?" She looked at the sky, which was a color she had decided to call forge, the specific deep orange that has iron in it, not gold exactly, something older than gold. She said, "I had been running models that all assumed eventual departure, exit strategies. I was optimizing for a version of things that involved leaving." He was quiet. She said, "I stopped being able to optimize for departure. Somewhere around the 42nd day, I kept running the models and they kept coming out, differently, pointing somewhere that didn't involve bridges." She looked at him. He was looking at her. She said, "I don't have a word for this color in the catalog yet. I've been calling it forge, in my head." He looked at the sky. He said, "It's a good word." She extended her hand. Not asking, not waiting for something, offering. She knew what she was offering. She knew exactly what she would feel when contact happened. She had calculated it, not coldly, not as a risk assessment, but as the one thing she had never done with the gift, made it something chosen, something welcome, something that went in both directions. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He took her hand. The warmth of it arrived immediately. His and hers, both. She breathed. She felt what she always felt when she touched him. The grief, the exhaustion, the room-locked loneliness. And this time she didn't step back. She held it. She let it matter. She let him feel, through the contact, that she was holding it, that someone was, that it didn't have to be carried entirely alone. She felt something shift, not a resolution, nothing so clean, something that had been very tight for a very long time becoming, just slightly, less tight. She said, very quietly, same color. He didn't ask what she meant. She didn't explain. The sky went from forge to something darker, something she didn't have a word for yet, something she would need to stay longer to name. She held his hand and watched it change. She stayed. The tower on the Voss estate was subsequently ordered sealed by royal decree, the lock removed entirely, the door left open. Ilara never went back to see it. She knew the ceiling had 412 stones. She didn't need to count them again. She was too busy learning the sky,